Hello, welcome to Living Faith's Midweek Devotions. Today I want to conclude the last 5 weeks of what we've been talking about for God's calling for my life. And we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting at verse 21. And Paul uses some interesting words here to encourage us in what we're doing. And so let's read those and then let's talk about them. Starting at verse 21. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. What Paul is addressing here is he's talking to Jews and Greeks. And so he's saying, for the Jews, if you're circumcised, you don't need to become the uncircumcised. You're already circumcised. So that has already set you apart as God's people. But it's not about the act of circumcision that makes you part of God's people. It's what God has done for you. Same thing with the Greeks or the Gentiles who are not circumcised. He's not saying you have to become circumcised to become a person of God, to become a believer. Rather, stay in the way that you are. What Jesus has done for you has changed you and has called you. Same thing with us today. When God has called you, where He's called you out in life, He's not saying you need to change who you are and what you do. But rather, what happens when God calls you is you keep the situation maybe the same, but the motivation in that situation does change. Everything now that you do for work, for life, the tasks that you do now is in service to Him. You're no longer a slave to your job or a slave to your boss, or that's who you specifically are serving. Rather, in everything you do, it's in service to God. See how that motivation changes? So even though your job might be difficult, it might be frustrating, your motivation in it changes because you're not a slave to that job. You're not a slave to this life. Rather, you're a slave to Christ. And that's actually freedom. That's being free to love Him in all that you do. You're not acting out of guilt anymore. You're not acting out of obligation, but rather, you're acting out of service, thankfulness, praise back to God. Your motivation has changed. God be with you this week as you change your focus in how you serve in your life, how you change your focus in life, in all the things that we've talked about throughout this series. May you always see that God's purpose and calling for your life is not to make money or just to serve in your job, but rather your service and calling in life is in service to Him for what He's done for you, that He has bought you at a price. He became a slave to sin, a slave to the punishment that we deserve, so that we're free indeed. God bless you, dear friends. Until next time.